So what are your thoughts on what do you think that's done to the way people look at stress? And I'm just curious what kind of change in the cultural zeitgeist you think is going on here?
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
really great question. There's no question there is a huge change happening. And one of the things we learned during the pandemic is that not all stress is created equal,
Mm,
right? So
mhm.
I think this message that everybody should just do mindfulness and lessen their stress, it may help, but look at all the factors that contribute to it.
Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. Well, welcome, Gail, to the podcast, The Mindful Cranks. We have Gail Stearns with us today. She is the author of a new book called Liberating Mindfulness, From Billion-Dollar Industry to Engaged Spirituality. So welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And we met a couple of years back at the Academy of Religion when you were just working on this book. And if I recall, you were on sabbatical so I had a chance to read your book in depth, and congratulations. And I find it to be a unique book because it's not just about mindfulness. So why don't we start by talking a little bit about your background, Gail, because you're a dean of the All Faiths Chapel at Chapman University, and I
Right.
think people would like to kind of get a sense of, how you got into mindfulness. But before we go there, I think it'd be worth hearing a little bit about your religious background and your interest in religious studies.
Sure. Thank you. It's
Mhm.
thanks for having me too, Ron. So I was studied in college. I studied anthropology and religion. I've always been interested in religion. I have my family was Presbyterian, so I went to church my whole background, but at times veered from what my parents taught me, and always kept my interest and curiosity in religion very much. And at some point came back to the Presbyterian Church, ended up going to seminary, McCormick Seminary in Chicago. And and then I was ordained as a minister, and I worked as a parish pastor in a suburb of Milwaukee for a while. What I found was that I was hungry to continue learning. It was in a stage when feminist theology was kind of emerging when I was in seminary, and I wanted to learn more about it. And so I decided to go back for a PhD, which really combined theology and gender studies and critical theory, some critical literary theory. So that kind of catapulted me back into academics. So after that, I just kept straddling that line between the religious institution and the academic institution.
So you spent some time in the Chicago area. That's where I'm
Yeah,
from, and
yeah.
I actually lived in Kenosha, Wisconsin, not too far from Milwaukee for
Oh,
a short
great.
period of
Yeah.
time. So you had experience as a pastor, and also now you have been teaching in academia and gradually moved into a position of being the dean. Can you say a little bit more about your program at Chapman?
Sure. Yeah, I think we have a incredibly unique interfaith center at Chapman University. I was looking for this kind of work because I directed a nonprofit campus ministry at Washington State University for years and taught at the university, and wanted to get into a college where it was more embedded within the actual university, that sort of work. So when I saw the position at Chapman, I applied, and the Fish Interfaith Center is, first of all, an architectural wonder, one of the most beautiful spaces I've ever been in. And we serve certainly the religious populations. We do a lot of interfaith work. We do a lot of justice work, a lot of, now I guess people would refer to it as diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And kind of the foundation as chaplains, serving the university ritual purposes, but also just finding ways to serve the students, faculty, staff needs, and working closely with the community as well.
And you have a lot of workshops and seminars and programs ongoing there, right?
We do. We have 10 people on our staff. We have 5 chaplains we have a director full-time, director of Muslim life, director of Jewish life, director of church relations, and constant programs. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I guess the big question then, obviously, is you have a Presbyterian background, a Christian ministry, so to speak. And so how did you get interested in mindfulness, and what was that journey like for you?
Yeah, I mentioned this in the book. Way back when I was in college, I learned some meditation from my religion professor, who was a Lutheran at Luther College, Lutheran minister, and he studied transcendental meditation. So he taught some of us that, and I began to do meditation at that time. I did meditation off and on through the years. And as my interest in interfaith grew, which really was an outgrowth of my Christian understanding of working with people of faith and working on issues that we had in common across the board, I began to just learn more about different contemplative traditions. And like I said, it was an off and on journey. You know, there were times I was doing meditation, there were times I wasn't. But in about 15 or 20 years ago, I kind of delved back into it, went to a workshop where Father Thomas Keating presented. And at that time, he kind of put out the challenge. He said, try 6 months, 20 minutes, twice a day of meditation, of centering prayer, which is what he taught, and it will change your life. And so I did, and it kind of did. It brought me back to a much more centered place, I would say. So I did that for quite a while and invited him to speak where I was working then. And eventually, mindfulness itself, it was just before I came down here to California, got this job, and I was in the midst of switching jobs. It's a very stressful time. And someone said, why don't you take that mindfulness-based stress reduction class, that this guy teaches about 7 miles away. So I did take the class, and what I discovered was it gave me some really wonderful, usable tools to do that were much more accessible to kind of use every day for stress relief. But also, I noticed that all the things I had learned already in meditation and contemplative prayer about just finding more equanimity were possible there. I had already experienced those through other meditation, but in some ways this was just more accessible. It's like, here, you do 1, 2, 3 today, and then you add 4 tomorrow and 5 the next day. And it's kind of an easy thing to learn and to practice, especially when you're in a stressful situation.
Mm-hmm. And the title of your book, I think, already signals there's something else going on here. Your book kind of starts out by describing your journey into mindfulness, and as you entered that world, some surprises came along. So you started out with MBSR, but as you kind of got your feet deeper into the current of the mindfulness worlds, what came up for you? It seems like you had some surprises along the way that you weren't maybe anticipating.
That's exactly right. When I came to California, I thought this might be, being the dean of an interfaith center, I deal with all the students. So even those that are, spiritual but not religious, or the NONES nuns, all of that. And I thought, well, maybe this is a good way to help them center. So I did get some training, taking the course through UCLA to become a mindfulness facilitator, and began to teach at Chapman. And what I discovered was it didn't sort of work for everyone. Some students that were experiencing some anxiety found that they were getting worse. Their anxiety was increasing, and they would thankfully come and talk to me about it. And so I would just have them stop, and we would do counseling, or physical movement like yoga sometimes helped. But what I began to discover was that if people were following it and doing mindfulness techniques every day, that it was stirring up some serious things within them. Possible PTSD, certainly. The idea that somehow mindfulness is going to just make you happier and calmer is really the opposite of what happens if you go deep enough, because you're going to actually get deep into all that stuff that is just below the surface, right? If you get very, very quiet inside. And I hadn't really heard teachers talking much about that and how to deal with that.
Right. And so on the one hand, from your firsthand experience as kind of being a guide and counselor for students coming to you, you were seeing this phenomena that you're describing. But on the other hand, as you went out into the mindfulness world, it was being kind of proffered and sold in such a way that it made promises that it would make you happy. Or can you talk a little bit about some of the discoveries you've made as you kind of mucked around in the mindfulness world out there?
In terms of, are you thinking about what's being sort of presented out there, or just how I began to work with it so it made sense? Or what do you?
Well, I mean, you describe like kind of sitting in on the LA Expo, the Wisdom 2.0, some of the things you were witnessing with corporate mindfulness. You even have a whole chapter on happiness. So I think you were seeing through the veil of some kind.
Right. I was. And, I realized that, I don't even know if I mentioned this in the book, but I think initially I was doing mindfulness classes and advertising them as, are you looking for happiness? So I went back and thought, I better delete all those old things. Because what I discovered is that was the primary promise that I was seeing everywhere. And it was from serious mindfulness teachers as well as advertisers. I found things like, you can buy mindful dermatology insurance, whatever that is. It's just unbelievable the way mindfulness is used, right? And all of it will make you happier and calmer and, more beautiful and all those things. And the problem with saying it will make you happier is that happiness is such a cultural construct. What is happiness? And so that's what I do, is kind of deconstruct happiness in the book. That it's not, what does that mean? And so much of it was a certain kind of calm personality that you would gain and you would not get upset at all. Or even with corporations, clearly the bottom line was important. You'll be more productive. You'll be more focused, and clearly there was an ulterior motive in bringing that kind of happiness to employees.
Yeah, I think I just recently, I didn't have time to read it, but there was an article recently that said Americans are the most driven culture that has been seeking out happiness, and at the same time they're the least happy. That this whole drive to seek happiness is maybe even misdirected in some way.
I like Joan Chittister, a quote of hers. She says, Americans have become so obsessed with the self in an individual way that we have become objects of our own concern, and it's like
objects of our own concern.
Yeah, the most important thing that we worry about is our own self and our own happiness, which is an American thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and the phrase self-care is big, and I'm not trying to negate the idea that we shouldn't take care of ourselves, but I was listening to I was listening to another podcast with Gabor Mate. I don't know if he's very popular in the trauma literature. I haven't read anything by him really, but he was talking about how child rearing practices in modern world, which are quite recent in the Western world, especially when Dr. Spock came around and told mothers, just let the baby cry, don't pick up the baby. And I was talking to somebody about this. I said, maybe it has something to do why we're so obsessed with self-care. So we got an unconscious message early on that you're on your own. Nobody else is going to take care of you. You're going to, you're in your room and crying your,
Yeah.
as a baby. I don't know, if it's Freudian stuff or what, but it is worth thinking about. Why are we so obsessed with the self, which seems somewhat counter to many religious traditions, not just Buddhism? Maybe we'll get to that as we get deeper into this. But so tell me about your experience at the Wisdom 2.0. What were your observations there that struck you as incongruent, perhaps?
Yeah, there was one observation that was so interesting, because I think I had read your book, but I don't remember reading this. And I had this experience and later went back and I went, oh, he wrote about this. It's been happening for years. So it was a later year that I experienced. I mean, I live in an area, I live in a city, right? So, unhoused people that I walk by, and it's not something to fear, we just, in a sense, learn to see people as human beings and go about business that way. And what the tone was very disturbing to me, that when we got there, the opening remarks, there was a huge emphasis on being very careful, because when you walk out, you're going to see these people. And what was fascinating is the whole idea that there was not a lot of attention to the kind of corporatization and capitalization that was being promoted there, right? And that here we are in San Francisco, where there's this huge problem. It is a problem that these people are perhaps sleeping in the doorway outside of our hotel, but we're not addressing that in the conference, number one. And then number two, that we were warned about these people. And the answer was, spend some more money and share cabs, as you leave. So I just found it was sort of like we were this club, right?
Right.
That had some knowledge that, we needed to preserve and be careful of, but we weren't going to actually think about what was happening as we walked out the door. So that I found, kind of incongruence when you're trying to be mindful, trying to think about your impact. It's clearly was not geared toward thinking about social impact. As more recent years, there have been more speakers dealing with issues of social concern, and more speakers who are maybe native speakers or Black speakers or that kind of thing. But still, the overarching thing was, we're kind of this club, and we're here and they're there.
Yeah, kind of an elite club, compartmentalizing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and your title is Liberating Mindfulness. So obviously, your background, that we were talking about earlier, must have influenced your whole way of thinking about the book and what you were seeing happening, like the example we just shared. So when you say liberating mindfulness, what do you mean by that? Liberating mindfulness. What does it need to be liberated from?
Yeah, I think it's, if we go back to that notion of happiness, what is happiness? One of the things Sarah Ahmed writes about this in her book, Happiness. One of the things we do in this culture is we'll pick a certain thing, and it becomes what she calls a happiness object, right? So it becomes
like a fetish.
In a sense, it is. I mean, it might be something like what your parents always tell you should do to be happy. So it might be, for example, heterosexuality. Find a opposite sex partner. It might be wealth. Which those are both happiness objects in our culture, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So they're things that we pursue, even though many of us know they're not really going to bring us happiness, but we could spend our whole life, pursuing them because that's what we've been told. And what I say in the book, and I really believe, is that the way mindfulness is being used, it has become a happiness object. So now people think, oh, this is my best tool for self-care, as you said, right? This is the thing that's going to bring me happiness, liberation. I have to do so that, we go from retreat to retreat to, teacher to teacher to app to app. And we're trying to gain this kind of inner peace through mindfulness. And what what I find troubling about that is that once a concept becomes an object of the culture like that, then it has actually bought into the values of the culture.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it kind of is almost up through osmosis. It's absorbing all of the Western cultural values.
Exactly. So consumerism, capitalism,
Individualism.
individualism especially. And
Mhm.
and the idea that my problems, anything that I experience, is my individual responsibility to solve through my own self-care. And again, I'm not negating self-care, like as you say, but that's what the message we're getting. And this is one of the primary tools now. And it really, ignores the fact that maybe I live in an abusive household and that some changes need to be made, right, in our whole sort of gender stratification or expectation or all of that, or the support I can get. But somehow, if I just do mindfulness, I'm going to be happy, right?
Yeah,
So,
it narrows the perspective or the focal setting in a way. It
exactly.
narrows it down to such an extent that the explanatory narratives then
Yeah,
are kind of confirming Western in all these values that we're talking
exactly.
about.
Yep.
So it's so interesting that I could, even there's an op-ed in the New York Times that I haven't had a chance to read, but it was something along these lines that like the medicalization of mental health problems are also sort of doing that. It's the stress is purely kind of an individualized medical, biological, maladaptive response to the environment. And so that brings up the question, like, because you do talk about stress a bit in the book too. And now that we've had the COVID shutdown and the pandemic, people, well, not all people, but some people had the chance to work at home, have some distance from their corporate workplace, the 9 to 5 routine, the commute, especially in LA, I would imagine. And so what are your thoughts on, what do you think that's done to the way people look at stress? And I'm just curious what you think, what kind of change in the cultural zeitgeist you think is going on here?
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
really great question. There's no question there is a huge change happening. And one of the things we learned during the pandemic is that not all stress is created equal, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think this message that everybody should just do mindfulness and lessen their stress, it may help, but look at all the factors that contribute to it. So we know that, for example, women had to quit or lose their jobs in the middle of the quarantine at a rate 3 to 4 times. This is mothers, what fathers did, right? So there's an unequal distribution of who takes on the stress of raising children, for example, and economic distribution. We know that African American and Black communities and Latinx communities, people were more likely to land in the hospital, be more seriously ill, to die from COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And often you look at people who were, the working class people who were the essential workers, right? Were the ones who landed there as well. So it's a whole class issue. So all these things, what we learned is that stress is not equal, so my stress of planning a party is not the same as, a mother trying to put food on the table for her child, but we tend to conflate those in our culture because we're all supposed to deal with them individually. And I think we learned that, and we also learned that much of stress is induced by the culture. So, corporate culture, that you had to be there, you had to be in the room with people all the time, you had to do all these kinds of meetings. People figured out that, no, I can do this work and I can still be with. So in some cases, people's stress was lessened because they didn't have to drive. We know the environment got a break, right?
Yeah.
We know that the atmosphere was less polluted. And so we know that all the stresses that both us and the earth are experiencing are actually not just, assumed. I mean, they're created, right? They're created.
Yeah, absolutely. And people are out in nature, they're taking walks. There wasn't much to do. And so, maybe corporate mindfulness programs weren't quite as appealing either, going back. It's like, wait a minute. The stress is kind of, don't put it on me here.
Yeah, exactly.
I worked at home and I wasn't stressed at all.
Yeah.
Or I wouldn't say I wasn't stressed at all, but I think it did shift people's ways of interpreting stress in some ways. And we probably don't know, we won't know, until time goes on what that's going to look like. But so liberating mindfulness, you go deep into other contemplative traditions as you're journeying to, for example, Turkey. You went to Turkey and met some amazing Sufi teachers, if I recall.
Right.
And there's one in particular that really impressed you, right? I remember.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about this woman?
Yes, Seminole Sargut, who is a sheikha, a Sufi sheikha, and I think I say in the book she's the only person I've ever been face to face with that I really felt was truly enlightened. And we use that term, like what is that term? But a person who is able to experience, and this is not the happiness we've been talking about, but deep joy in sorrow and, in good times. So I suppose one of the differences between the more spiritual traditions of contemplation and then secular mindfulness is the notion of kind of transparency. It's almost like the spirit, she would say Allah, the God, moves through her in a sense. I mean, you meet her and you think you are in the presence of the divine. I mean, there is just this incredible love. I suspect if I was face to face with the Dalai Lama, I'd have that experience. There are just individuals that you hear about that way. And there is a kind of transparency of that spirit that just moves through them, in the sense that it's not just about them, and yet they've gotten there through years and years of very serious discipline.
Very serious discipline.
Exactly. Right. Of prayer, of meditation, of community, of, working with community, of study, of whatever their, scriptures and founders and their teachers are.
And their way of life too. Right?
Exactly. And a way of living. Yeah, exactly. Right.
And,
so that I was just deeply moved by meeting her. I mean, it's hard to be in that presence. I just wept the whole time. I couldn't. Later I went, what was I doing? I just had tears on my face for an hour and a half,
Interesting.
Yeah, it was fascinating.
And she made some statement that struck me too, that it's not us that gives thanks.
Right.
Can you say more? What was that? What was that about, that statement?
Yeah, there was a question asked of her about the idea of, is it important to give thanks? That idea of just constantly giving thanks. And she said, it's not us that gives thanks. It's Allah who gives thanks through us. And again, it's that notion of transparency, that this is not about us as individuals. It's the gratefulness of all of life and of all that lives and breathes and has its being all the time.
And that's in stark contrast to like this gratitude journal craze.
Right.
Which, is quite popular, right? Just, But and then you also ventured into talking to some Sikhs as well. Right.
Yeah. And there's Valerie Kaur's book, See No Stranger, is incredibly powerful. And she talks about her grandfather who would, recite a Shabad constantly through the day. And I just love how she talked about it. She said he would, it was a prayer, but she said it was actually more like he was taking a deep breath with every time he would say Waheguru, Waheguru. And so it was this sense of, it was just the way he lived, what he breathed every single minute of the day, which is a very different way of thinking about giving thanks and living a kind of this contemplative life. But he was repeating the scriptures as a kind of, gratefulness again, as a kind of deep breath all through his day. And the Sikhs I have just found them to have some really wonderful understanding of that and how they repeat the scriptures and chant and share in community, and all of it is about service. All of it is, we're doing this in order to do seva, or service to others.
Yeah, I remember my first time to New Delhi, and I went to visit the Guru Dara Bangla Sahib. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. The Sikh house of worship in Delhi, beautiful place. But I remember just when I just first entered it, and the person that was leading, I don't know what you refer to, the person that's reading from the book.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And I was hit by almost this light or this energy. And I was like, whoa. And he was just full of joy. He was reading, and I was really taken over by this presence feeling. And I'll never forget that. And then, they feed the poor, everyone can come, and they have these massive kind of set up where people can come and get these meals.
Yeah, the langar meals that are free meals.
Yeah.
And every Gurdwara anywhere in the country, you'll find them doing that. I mean, that's just a state. And, on the in war zones and in places of natural disasters, they'll show up to do that always.
And so there's something else going on in these other contemplative traditions that contemporary modern secular mindfulness has left out. And I'm wondering, especially when you talk about centering prayer, which you mentioned earlier, what do you think that centering prayer adds to mindfulness practice? And vice versa, what do you think mindfulness practice adds to centering prayer?
Yeah, that's a great. One of the things that I already mentioned is the notion of transparency, and I guess the idea of devotion that is missing in mindfulness. Obviously, there's no sense of devotion to anything other than oneself, right? Or outside of oneself. I mean,
Yeah.
And so there is a sense that you are doing this in service of something greater than yourself. And also that you mentioned the way of life being so important, that for Christians, kind of the way of Jesus, right? So people often talk about Jesus being the way, which is a way of living, in service and compassion and knowing that you're not alone, and that in fact you're here to serve others. And what I find that the contemplative traditions have is that undergirding ethic, the ethic of service, and the kind of understanding that this is not about me. I'm not doing this just for me. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't learn some of the same things. So, for example, I love Father Thomas Keating's description of centering prayer as divine psychotherapy, because, which is because, as I mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation, what happens is you get quiet enough and deep enough, you're going to have things come up. We all have layers and layers, right? We know enough about psychotherapy now to know we have layers of things inside that we can continue to work on, that we can continue to learn to let go of. We continue to learn to forgive ourselves and others as we age. And that silent prayer, it can really begin to bring those things up and teach us a lot. And yet the point is not simply to take care of myself. I mean, the point is that I'm really here to be a better person for everyone in the world. And that ethic is built in, that ethic of justice, that ethic of caring, of serving, is why we do what we do. I think that's a big difference between the contemplative traditions and the contemporary mindfulness movement. The contemporary movement will claim to be about happiness and compassion, but there's no sort of foundation, that says, why am I called to compassion? what am I part of that's greater than myself? All of that. And the spiritual traditions offer that.
Yeah, and I think that because the contemporary mindfulness programs and so forth they've come out of more of the therapeutic culture to begin with, which it is about, self-help. And so, as you're saying, they're not coming out of that larger context. But when you say devotion, that will turn a lot of people off who have been drawn to mindfulness for the very reasons that it's not affiliated with any type of
That's right.
religious religious institution, I should say. And I think that your attraction to people like Thomas Keating and the Sufi, I mean, these are not orthodox, institutionalized aspects, right? These are more on the fringe of those institutions too.
Yeah, very much so. I think that the mystical traditions, the contemplative practices are in every religion, but they've really been marginalized in many ways. They don't, you really sort of develop this kind of deeper sense within oneself and in your shared community, and rather than in the authority figure in the religion, right? So they haven't been dominant because they don't build an institution very well.
Yeah.
How's that?
This kind of spiritual but not religious. I was joking about this, that it's a reaction to the religious but not spiritual.
That's
good.
I like that.
Yeah. And so people like Thomas Keating, they recognize this problem, but devotion is still a word.
Yeah.
But I think one maybe translation of that would be a wider vision of something beyond the self. It doesn't have to necessarily be in religious feelings of devotion in a religious orthodox way, and so what would that look like? Something that's much wider in scope than just relieving my daily stresses as an individual. And
you're right. I mean, that's a word that, and maybe a better way to say it is sort of looking at kind of devotional traditions, but the mystic side within them. I think that the values and the ethics are carried in those traditions, which is what I'm getting at. It's not so much that you're not doing something blindly for some other thing, because the term devotion, the term God, all of those need to be unpacked. It's really about a greater energy of love, right? That you're in the stream of in some ways. But one of the things that happens is that, and I think this is mindfulness movement would say, which I believe is something that grows out of Buddhism, the idea that you should just do this for the sake of doing it. Don't do it. Don't sit because you want to get gain anything. You just sit, and then it begins to happen, right? You begin to get quieter, but you shouldn't have a particular intention in mind. My argument is that we're using mindfulness with very clear intention, which is a more corporate capitalist intention, right?
Yeah.
So why not incorporate the tools of mindfulness? So you asked, what does mindfulness bring, say, to centering prayer? Why not incorporate the tools of mindfulness that actually are in some ways more accessible today for people to use, incorporate those into a kind of stream of intention that is about something greater than myself, right? So that there's an ethical underpinning to it that we all agree on before we jump into it, rather than saying, well, whatever happens will happen. Then I may be doing it in service of some intention I don't really mean to do it in service of. So I think grounding it in those traditions, but then the tools are great, something like even simple stuff like, using acronyms to say, just stop, take a breath, observe, proceed. Those kinds of things are really for our contemporary minds. the ancient mystics wouldn't have used that, but they did that. They did it. It's just that mindfulness offers us some tools for it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So mindfulness, as you said in your book, in several chapters, it is being used in that way to help with social activism. And
yeah, there are places we're seeing that now, which is really exciting. And often within, various kinds of spiritual traditions or out of those. But yeah, we are seeing that now, which is great.
And you have done a number of serious, well, I use the word serious, but Vipassana retreats
Yeah.
and silent extended retreats. And
Yeah.
what did you learn from these? And I mean, what,
Mm-hmm.
You've done centering prayer, and you've been involved in your Presbyterian ministry. And how are you integrating this as a religious person? I'm wondering.
Yeah, it's complex, isn't it? I just came in August. I went on a 2-week Vipassana retreat in New Mexico, 2-week silent retreat. And because it was in the mountains of northern New Mexico, we couldn't even cheat and look at our cell phone. It just didn't work.
No coverage.
So there was no way to do anything other than just be there and be silent. And, of course, nature didn't hurt, but it was just stunningly gorgeous. But in the forest and the meadows there. But what's interesting is that when I took the course at UCLA, I remember my teacher, Diana Winston, knowing that I came from a Christian background, we had to do 1 week of silent retreat. And she sort of tentatively said, I think you should go to a Buddhist center. And I was like, fine, I'll do that. And I think, and so because I do interfaith work, and I'm not, I'm not afraid of that. And what I discovered was that I found mindfulness and the kind of the meditation tools, as I said, to be really useful. But I think because I'm also, a person who studies theology and practices, theologically and all that, that I wanted to go where deep as I could into what I thought were really the roots of that, where the ethics were. So the ethics that have been kind of stripped out of that as it's taught today. And the place that I saw that the most was really in Vipassana Buddhism. I think it comes out of Vipassana. So if you were to sit at a Vipassana retreat, there's a heavy emphasis on mindfulness, the way Buddhism is interpreted, right? That it's really about observing the mind. So for me, to be a teacher of it, I wanted to go as deep as I could into the tradition of what does it mean to really observe the mind. And I find the certain Vipassana teachers I've discovered, I think are, for me, really, really help. So, I mean, I'll just give you an example of something in this retreat that I've practiced this for a number of years. So when I sit and do Vipassana, I really do Vipassana, which is really observe your mind, observe, all of your senses, and sometimes stop and investigate a bit, but then continue your observation. So when I sit for 2 weeks, some fears begin to come up. It's kind of like, oh, hello there. I thought I dealt with you last time. You're still there, right? And because they come up, and I realized that there are these layers of understanding fear. So in Buddhism, it's really not the fear of something that's so terrifying. It's your aversion to having to feel the fear. So it's like Vipassana helps you to just see those layers like that. It's like, oh, there's nothing wrong with feeling the fear. It's just that I'm so afraid of feeling the fear that I block it out, right? So what is the aversion really to? And Vipassana really gets at those subtleties, if you will. And I find as a teacher, that's really helpful, so that when I'm teaching a student, what we're just calling mindfulness, and they're having fears coming up, it's like, yeah, maybe you just befriend that fear. It's just going to be there for a while, Maybe it's not something you have to run away from. So it helps me to understand the nuances, I guess, as a teacher and as a spiritual person. That's why I like to go deeper into it. And I don't expect that everybody will do that, spend 2 weeks in silence and, and do that several times a year. I think that's unusual, probably, but I know you've done silent retreats before.
Not anymore, no.
Yeah, you used to. Yeah.
It's interesting when you say observe the mind.
Yeah.
What's the approach in Vipassana to observing the observer that's observing the mind?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's sort of all going on simultaneously, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're noticing that the mind is, busy doing things, and then you're starting to think, who's noticing the noticing,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so just being aware that there are these different levels of observation going on, in a sense. There's a deeper self that can be sitting and just knowing it's happening without getting caught into it. So, and of course, the word self isn't appropriate really either. There's no self, but just that ability, the ability to observe. The observing itself happens on a number of levels. How's that?
Well, yeah. I'm not looking for a right answer. I'm just curious that the quagmire of the mind, in terms of its speed by which it can morph into any state, or the quagmire of language as well.
Right.
When we try to escape the omnipresence of what seems to be everywhere. It seems like there's a point at which, at least my sense is, we're not going to win the battle. It seems like there's a point where it's hopeless. Does the Christian notions of surrender somewhere, does that help you in Vipassana?
That's an interesting question. Mm-hmm. I think for me, somebody read my book and said, "Wow, you're more of a Christian than I thought you were," and I'm like, "Am I?" I think it's just because I've studied it and I've taught it for so long, But I'm marginal as a Christian. It's just what you said about, mm-hmm. I'm more on the mystic side too, I suppose.
Yeah.
But it's almost like the primary purpose. I noticed this in the retreat I just did, that many of the practitioners are very serious Vipassana practitioners. So truly their wish, and then this is of course a dichotomy in Vipassana, because they have a desire, and part of it is you just want to experience what is, not have a desire. And mm-hmm. and this is an admitted a long ongoing conversation, but the desire really is to break the cycle of suffering, to be able to not be caught in those cycles of thought, right? Not be caught up in the things that make us suffer in our minds, and just to kind of be free, to be free of the tyranny of the mind, so to speak, that just keeps catching us. That's really not my goal when I go to those retreats. So that may be the difference. My goal is, I just want to understand this. I want to understand what this is. And every time I come out, I have a bit more of a breakthrough. It's like, okay, mm-hmm. now I get fear better than I did the last time, right? I have mm-hmm. a different relationship with fear than I used to.
Understand, that's a nice word.
Yeah, because my sense is that my freedom, sort of I don't know what word to use, is really not in my control. In Christianity, it's all about grace, that we are, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. that I will never be a perfect human being. There's no such thing. That we are forgiven because we do make mistakes, right? In Christianity, you traditionally talk about we're all sinners, right? But that just means that we're human, and right. I don't have any delusions, to use a Buddhist term, that I will ever get rid of all that. This week I thought of 4 times I thought I offended people, and I'm like, oh, I have to just learn to move on, and to that's going to always happen. Yeah,
I like the word grace, this notion of grace, and
yeah.
Well, if you could translate that, samsara, you can't fix it, and like you say that, but on the other hand, understanding mm-hmm. that we're trapped, it is itself an opening.
It is. I mean, it's, I often use the term awareness a lot with, students, that we're just becoming, so it is self-aware. So there, in that sense, it's, it is learning more about ourselves. For me, it's because I want to be able to be a better person, because I just want to understand it. I want to be able to help other people understand it. And, it's really my understanding of my goal of this is very different. I have deep, deep respect for those people who really believe they may be freed in this life. And I hope they are. I've met, like I said, I've met someone who I feel is an enlightened being. It's possible. I don't think I'm ever going to get there. I have no illusions. I think I have way too far to go.
Yeah, well, the Buddhists kind of built in the multiple lives to take into account that issue.
Yeah, I know. And see, that's the other piece that's not really in my schema. So
I know, I'm just kidding.
I get this one. And thank goodness for grace. That's my, that's my
But
sense.
that is a good point, that it's something you can't will.
Right.
Strive, because then you're back in the same structure of positing that you have to arrive somewhere else, or it's some sort of state that's not in the present. There's a lot of tricks, the mind that keeps projecting forward. Liberation or something is some sort of state that you have to get to.
Right. And the Vipassana practitioners and teachers I've talked to admit that this is a huge, this is a huge thing that goes on, and
and I think
it's difficult.
Right. And, there's a lot of layers there too of the mind that
Right.
having to do with our how language plays into it. I think that's another subject. That's another podcast episode, I guess. But, this is a great conversation, Gail.
Yeah,
maybe it's a good
fun.
place to end. And I didn't know we were going to venture into this deep territory, but
That was great. Thank you.
yeah. But thank you. And I hope everybody will take a look at Gail's book, Liberating Mindfulness. And thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Ron.
I'm Ron Purser, host of The Mindful Cranks. In this episode, I spoke with Gail Stearns about her new book, Liberating Mindfulness, From the Billion-Dollar Industry to Engaged Spirituality, published by Orbis Books 2022. Gail is the Irvin C. Eddie Chapman Dean of the Wallace All Faiths Chapel and Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Peace Studies at Chapman University. She is also an ordained minister of the Presbyterian Church. You can learn more about Gail and her work by going to show notes on our website, www.mindfulcranks.com. I hope you can take time to leave a review on a podcast app of your choice. This will help to ensure the longevity of this podcast. Thanks for listening.